On Easter Sunday, the Sunday of the Resurrection, the Gospel we read is that of John 20, 1-9. On the first day of the week, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning, while it was still dark, and saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and told them, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived at the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial cloths there, but did not go in. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw the burial cloths there, and the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Then the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. For they did not yet understand the scripture that he had to rise from the dead. Since last night, the Church has been celebrating the great solemnity of the resurrection of the Lord. His resurrection was so great, so extraordinary, and so good for everyone that the Church will celebrate it for 50 days in a season better known as Easter season. Easter means to pass over. And while the Jewish Passover celebrates God's passage through Egypt, making possible the liberation of the Jews from slavery, Christians now celebrate the Easter of Jesus. We celebrate the fact that he has passed from death to life, and that this passage has allowed our liberation from the chains of sin and death. Thanks to Jesus' passing, Christians are now free. And as long as we don't fall back into sin, we can enjoy the freedom of being the children of God. Therefore, in order not to lose that freedom that Jesus attained for us, we must, at all costs, avoid all kinds of sin and live life as he asks us to. This Easter season will only conclude on the feast of the Pentecost, and the predominant color throughout these 50 days is white, a sign of celebration and joy. Well, as we know, the resurrection of Jesus is the most incredible thing that could have happened to us, because it gives meaning to life and makes his entire message coherent. And this is precisely what Paul says to the Corinthians. If Jesus had not risen, our message would be useless, and your faith useless too, because if he had not risen again, the Christian path, that of spending and wearing oneself out for others, would make no sense, and living as Jesus proposes would be foolish, and we would probably be wasting our lives. But what makes his journey worthwhile is that he has come back to life, and he has taught us that if we live as he wants us to live, we too will overcome death and rise again. Well, this is the essence of the Christian message. This is the good news. So let us live as Jesus teaches us, and let us always choose to stand on the side of truth, on the side of justice, and on the side of life. And let's do so, even if it proves difficult, even if it costs us our lives. Because if we do, we will be happy here and now, and then we will live forever. Now, during this first week of Easter, the Church invites us to reflect carefully on what happened around the resurrection of the Lord, and on the apparitions that took place immediately afterwards. That is why today's text begins by telling us that on the first day of the week, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning, while it was still dark. John says that on the first day of the week, Sunday, dawn was approaching when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. It was still dark because although there was a full moon and enough light to go to the tomb, Easter Sunday is the first Sunday after the appearance of the first full moon of spring in the northern hemisphere. However, it was still too dark to enter the tomb, so we can assume that they thought they would wait after they arrived. The first thing that Mary saw upon arriving and that totally disconcerted her was that the stone was removed from the tomb. That is, the tomb had been opened. This was very strange because the stone had to have been moved on the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath the Jews did not do any work. Furthermore, the Gospels tell us that it was a large and heavy stone, and undoubtedly several people were needed to move it. But also, and this was the most surprising thing, she could see that the tomb was empty. Well then, that's what she was going to run and tell the other disciples. They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. Here we see that Mary was not alone, because the text speaks in the plural. So surely, as the other Gospels relate, she had gone there with other women. Finding the tomb open and empty was really very strange. Mary was so disconcerted by this fact that the text says that she ran and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. Now let's remember that from the tomb to where the disciples were staying, which specialists suppose was the cenacle, it would be about 15 minutes walking. Mary then, of course, ran to find Peter, who was the head of the community, but she also looked for the disciple whom Jesus loved most. According to tradition, this beloved disciple was John, and he was the youngest of the group. And at that time, maybe he was still just a young boy. But both were leaders in the community, and both were authorities in the church. It is worth noting here that the evangelist would always seek to associate Peter with a beloved disciple. For example, let's not forget that at the Last Supper, Peter asked the beloved disciple, who was leaning on Jesus, to find out who the traitor was. Anyway, upon finding them, Mary said to them, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." This was highly unexpected news, terrible for them, and very painful, because they not only didn't have him alive, but now they didn't even have him dead. Everyone must have been deeply shocked. So the evangelist says that Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. In a great hurry, obviously, because if what Mary said was true, what had happened was a tragedy. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived at the tomb first. Here the evangelist includes a strange note and tells us that the youngest disciple arrived at the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial cloths there, but did not go in. This comment is very important for the catechesis of the evangelist, because although John was a reference for everyone, and he was the one that Jesus loved the most, he was not the one who entered the tomb first. He deferred to Peter and allowed him that privilege. The church, from the beginning, always considered that Peter and his successors, the popes, were the ones most responsible, the heads, for the church. And even though there were other very valuable leaders who were very dear to Jesus, Peter had preference. But the evangelist also tells us that John bowed down because the opening was low and it was necessary to crouch down to enter. It is worth mentioning here that the Emperor Hadrian, around the year 132, destroyed the tomb and built a temple in its place in honor of the goddess Venus. 2 centuries later, Constantine destroyed the Temple of Venus and ordered the construction of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. And within the Great Basilica, which also covers the Calvary, he built a small chapel to cover only the tomb with a low opening to enter. Today, if one visits the Holy Sepulchre, one has to bow down to enter. The text also tells us that the most loved disciple saw the burial cloths there. It would appear that the Jewish way of burying the dead consisted of covering the face and sometimes the whole body with a sheet or shroud, and then wrapping it with bandages. For example, the story of the resurrection of Lazarus tells us that he came out, tied hand and foot, with burial bands, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. So our text tells that when Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw the burial cloth there, and the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Surprisingly, the evangelist describes in great detail how the shroud was, giving the impression that he had been a direct witness of what happened. The truth is that something very strange had happened, and Peter was unable to explain it. The only thing he could think of was that they had taken Jesus' body. But that didn't make much sense either, because who would have done it? And why? And on the Sabbath? And even if they had stolen the body, they would not have left either the bandages or the shroud behind. So while Peter was trying to make sense of what had happened, the text says that the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. This disciple saw the empty tomb, and just at the sight of it, he was filled with grace. He was filled with the certainty of faith that Jesus had returned to life, and he was convinced that he had risen. The empty tomb was only the trigger for his faith, and faced with that fact, just as had happened with the women, it was evident to the beloved disciple that the Lord had risen. Well then, this faith is exactly what is expected of us, that without having seen, we believe. The text ends by telling us that for they did not yet understand the scripture that he had to rise from the dead. They had not understood that Jesus was going to conquer death, and that was why he is the Messiah. They had not understood that God is stronger than death, nor had they understood that if we walk with God, we will always win. To conclude, I invite you to rejoice and be grateful for the resurrection of Jesus, and ask God for His grace to realize and have that same certainty that the beloved disciple had of knowing that, indeed, the Lord had risen, and that life and goodwill always triumph over death and evil. Society of Jesus, Jesuits, Peru.